Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and today we are talking about the first of the 500 Kingdoms series, because the book that I wanted to start this week I couldn't get out of the library, and we used to own a copy and I don't know where it is. So, we're doing this instead. Mercedes Lackey's The Fairy Godmother is the first in the 500 Kingdoms series, and it's a very, very interesting concept. We've I have covered the Enchanted Forest Chronicles at a previous point in the distant past, and the Enchanted Forest Chronicles relate to this. We will get to why momentarily. In the Enchanted Forest Chronicles, Patricia really posits a world in which fairy tales just work that way, and they work that way in a combination of just sort of the fundamental motion of the universe and a sort of a strange gentleman's agreement. Um, like that there's just this fundamental agreement on a lot of levels that that's how things work. For example, when you have that you have the wicked uncle Prince Rupert, and the thing is, he's not what we would definably call wicked, but his sister and her husband have gone off on a that's the prince and princess. They have gone off, king and queen. They've gone off on a quest of some kind, and they have left Uncle Rupert in charge of his nephew, their son, as sort of the regent. And the thing is, because he is an uncle, he is sort of obligated by how society functions to be wicked, and he has to do something very bad to his nephew and take over the kingdom. And so the plan, as proposed by the nephew, is that the nephew be abandoned in the enchanted forest to have adventures, because his nephew wants adventures, and that's a typical thing, abandoning kids in the enchanted forest. But the thing is that, as is pointed out, it's not really all that. I mean, it's not good for him, but it's also not all that wicked to give a child exactly what they want. Especially if you still want what's best for them, and by abandoning you mean leave them with plentiful supplies in the not terribly unsafe place that they absolutely want to be in. Um, and so at the end of the book, Prince Rupert breaks his promise to abandon his nephew in the Enchanted Forest and sends him away to boarding school, which, while it is going to be very good for him, it is in fact wicked to not only break promises, but to send a kid away to boarding school when he had been promised adventures in the forest, and then he was going to lie and, do the evil, regent king thing, which, makes him a villain. Uh, but it's all done by this sort of very civilized agreement that this is how he's supposed to act as the villain. Cimarine at the start of the very first book talks about how how she always was more interested in what the princes were supposed to be saying than memorizing where in the script about being kidnapped by a giant, where in that script that she is supposed to scream. There's a script for being kidnapped by giants. So, it's a very civilized and odd set of things. The Fairy Godmother posits a world in which fairy tales are true because the universe makes it so, but in this case, the universe making it so is a much, much crueler, much more insidious and in its way horrific sort of thing. You have this concept of the tradition, all capitalized, um, in which the idea is that you have this force that is neither good nor malicious, that effectively enforces fairy tales, popular plot lines, onto people. If your life begins to resemble, as Elena Klovis does in this, her life begins to resemble that of a Cinderella story. That is, her father remarries to a woman with two daughters. The woman with two daughters is not very nice and gets worse and worse as years go on, and her father dies, and Elena is forced into having to be a servant in her own home, etc., etc. It's the Cinderella story. Um, and so the tradition wants desperately to make her follow that, but there's a problem. There is no prince available to come and sweep her off her feet. In the country that they're in, there is no prince. And this is a thing that happens, is that the universe, but the problem is, of course, so that the universe obviously doesn't just force people into stories like Cinderella, which is fairly mild and has a fairly happy ending. It will also force them into more horrifying stories, which, yes, Disney's Rapunzel isn't all that horrifying, but the original Rapunzel, which involved many young men falling to their deaths into thorny bushes and being blinded, and girls trapped in the top of towers in isolation. And Mercedes Lackey does go there and pointing out that somebody who was isolated at the top of a tower without any, without any interactions with other people at all, are very likely to go stark raving crazy. And so, it's an active choice on her part, on the part of Godmother Bella and later Elena, to actively prevent this. Now, the Fairy Godmother thing, is that fairy godmothers are self-appointed guardians who attempt to steer the tradition. That is, if they can't prevent the tradition from forcing people into a particular story, they will actively sculpt a situation so that the tradition will follow the trajectory they want. So, for example, now the idea is that Elena gets recruited to be a fairy godmother because the tradition basically drops magic, like sort of clouds of magical power. And the idea is that if you are in a story, the tradition will put more and more magic to bear on the problem. But if your life resembles a story but can't follow that story, you wind up sort of stacked up neck deep in magic and without it having anywhere to go. And so Elena gets recruited because she's not only has the talent, but because she also has all of this magic built up and gets trained to be a fairy godmother. One of the things that they do early in this book, after the recruitment, is that you have a young woman who is being pushed into the Rapunzel story, that she is pregnant, that she starts craving Rampion, and that she can't, to the point that she can't eat anything else, and her husband is basically going to get pushed into stealing Rampion from a evil sorceress's garden, which is the traditional story. And so what Elena does is she finds the evil sorceress who has set up shop in town for the purpose of taking advantage of this moment, and basically takes her place. She locks the woman up and knocks her out with some magic and takes her place and plays the role of evil sorceress, and thus is able to circumvent the spell. And what she does is, instead of demanding the baby and sticking her in a tower, she instead demands the baby and then forcibly pushes that baby into becoming part of the Princess and the Pea plotline, enchants her in such a way that she will become that instead of entering into the Rapunzel story. And it makes the tradition move things onto a much gentler, much less horrifying story. And that's what godmothers do, is they actively shepherd what the tradition is doing to try to make sure that it does things that are good endings, that are less horrifying endings, that are less stressful. And so you have this whole story which ends with Katche the Deathless, which is the star of the Firebird, Russian Firebird story, that one of them makes its way into Elena's country, and it's sort of like, a folktale from Russia, because different regions have different traditions in the same way that different regions have different stories, because what the what the tradition does is it follows the popular tales being told. So in France, you get one set of stories, and in Russia, you get another. And the Cache has decided 100 years ago that he was going to make his way into a different tradition where he could do whatever he wanted in that place, because the tradition in that place wouldn't know how to handle him. Anyways, so they wind up managing to sort of beat him by the skin of their teeth. There is a love story with a prince who has to go through a whole redemption arc. It's a thing. But what's really, really interesting in these books is just this concept of the tradition. Like I said, it bears a certain semblance to Patricia Reedy, but like I said, where with Patricia Reedy, at least part of this is also a societal structure, a gentleman's agreement that this is how things are going to work. As much as glass slippers are for deserving merchants' daughters, not for princesses. As much as there are a certain type of magical rules there about just how these things function, at the same time, it's very, very civilized and a very, very light and fluffy and happy set of stories. And while these are light and fluffy and happy, they're more adult. They point out some of the darker sections of fairy tales, but they also are doing the fractured fairy tale thing in that you're talking about people who are very consciously aware that a fairy tale is taking place and are specifically trying to avoid making that happen. It's not just fairy tales, though. It's also, popular songs. The song of the, dramatic wastrel, the young man who comes to a young woman and seduces her and then leaves her pregnant and alone, and so on. It's a very popular story. It's not a fairy tale, it's just a very popular fictional trope in effect, and the tradition also functions in tropes. Anyway, so it's interesting, and it's a slightly different take on fairy tales. Mercedes Lackey does a lot of fairy tales. Her Elemental Masters series is, if you read between the lines, not very deeply, they're also fairy tales. But those are just straight up rewritings of fairy tales, whereas this is very much the fractured fairy tale genre. But more than that, it's not fourth wall breaking, but it is conscious. It is, it is the Scream movies. It is the people who are in the horror flick who have realized they're in a horror movie and are actively trying to avoid doing what victims in horror movies do. In this case, it's people who are in a fairy tale and they realize how the fairy tale works, so they're trying to make sure that the fairy tale goes the way they want it to go. So, the 500 Kingdoms obviously is the notion of a collection of 500 kingdoms where this functions, and there's a variety of these stories, all of which you can sort of count through and take note of all of these various familiar and less familiar fairy tales and folk tales as they come up and when people are using them and not. This first one is, of course, Elena's story. After this, she becomes a tertiary character. She's present, but this is her story, and everything after this, this is the happy ending. So I'm going to be doing this series while I wait for the other series to work its way into the library, and you'll find out what that other series is when I get there. But in the meantime, I think that's all that I'm going to be saying on the Fairy Godmother, so that's everything, and I will see you all next week.